All right, so we talked about the energy systems in the last video, and we used 17.5 as an example. I'm going to talk about the strength systems or the complexity of the strength systems in functional fitness or CrossFit or whatever you want to define it, and how to train them. One exercise that I used to do when I was going out and doing a bunch more camps, I would ask people, do you think Richard Froning is strong? And I would usually ask that after I said, what is strength? And everybody has an answer like, oh yeah, like deadlift. If I could deadlift something strong, if I could snatch something, or if I could clean something, then that means that I'm strong. And based on the demographic that was there, I'd get a raise of hands who thinks Rich Froning's strong, and every single person would put their hand up. And the point of the exercise, it's not for me to say whether or not Rich Froning is strong. I only used him because at the time he was winning the games and he was really visible and everyone knew what his max lifts were. And then I asked if instead of everybody in this room being a CrossFitter that had context for what Rich Froning's able to do on a broad level, what if everybody in here was a strongman? Do you think that the strongmen would think that Rich Froning is strong? Or was a bunch of gold medalist weightlifters? Or let's say I grabbed a group of gymnasts and had asked them, and if Rich Froning can't do an iron cross, most of them would probably be like, yeah, well, he's not strong. Because strength is always context specific. And I think that gets lost in CrossFit sometimes because people develop strength in the typical ways and then they don't understand why the movement breaks down when they actually try to go out and perform in the sport that they're trying to play. So 17.3 is a workout where it was an ascending amount of chest to bar pull-ups and a descending amount of squat snatches, where the squat snatches were going up in weight every single time you broke through the next minute of time. I'm not going to go into what the actual workout is because there were a bunch of memes about it being like a math formula to try to explain it and write it up, and it would have taken up too much space. But I know there were a bunch of people that have 185 pound on the women's side or 275 pound max snatches on the male side, but then they got into that workout and they failed 2 bars before they even got to the max weight. So they had the strength levels to attain the highest level of load in the actual workout, but they weren't able to express it. And the expression of strength in a CrossFit setting is not, can you lift this weight? It's not, can you snatch 245 or can you snatch 265? It's, can you snatch 265 with your heart rate at a certain level? So that means, can your heart take the blood pressure surge that's created to create the intrathoracic and intra-abdominal pressure to snatch 265 when it's beating at 165 beats per minute? That's a different level of contextual strength than what happens if you're just a weightlifter who can sit down in between their lifts and go out onto the platform and lift and rest 4 minutes between. It's a completely different level of cardiac stress, and the system has to self-organize differently to be able to snatch that. Or can you lift when your respiratory levels are at a high rate? So your diaphragm is a major spinal stabilizer, and if it's breathing at 30 breaths per minute and you have to stabilize the spine at the same time, do you have the strength to actually still stabilize the spine and snatch 265 at that level of speed and under those levels of fatigue? Or lifting at muscular fatigue peripherally. So we're doing a bunch of chest to bar pull-ups, get blood in the biceps, lats and everything in the scapula gets fatigued, and now I gotta catch in the bottom of the snatch and I have to be able to stabilize overhead. If some of your local stabilizers are exhausted and you don't have the ability to stabilize those reps under those levels of fatigue, then you can't express the basic strength that you would develop in a normal strength training program. And then lifting with, I put fatigue in quotes because it could just be general fatigue in the legs. So if you did 100 wall balls and then 5 snatches at 80 snatches at 80% of your 1 rep max, do you have the ability when there's all this fatigue substrate and burning in your legs to still use your motor pattern? So what I'm going to talk about with regards to training is how do I try to isolate and improve this type of limitation, assuming I'm training in 17.3. So like we talked about in the energy system, there's carryover. So getting good at this system would be similar to getting good at something like 16.2, except the movements in 16.2 are toes to bar, double unders, and squat cleans, whereas in 17.3, it's chest to bars and squat snatches. So there is carryover in those two systems, and one of the artistic aspects of this sport is figuring out how to find all the systems that you need to get trained in CrossFit and pick the best bang for your buck distribution for that athlete with the highest statistical likelihood of success year in and year out, regardless of what Dave Castro selects as the workouts. That's a very, very, very difficult task. However, it's a fun problem to try to solve as a coach. So from a movement perspective, like we covered in the energy systems, we'd have the chest to bar pull-ups, which would be lat, scap, and then your thoracic cervical spine. The carryover movements on here on chest to bars would be toes to bar, bar muscle ups, pull-ups, pretty much anything where you're hanging from a bar is gonna require the same level of mobility and optimal movement in those patterns. Could probably put grip and forearm flexor ability in there as well. And then for the squat spinal extension against the flexed hip. So a lot of people, when they get down into the bottom of a squat, they don't have the ability to extend their spine to get more vertical against a flexed hip. So they can do it up to a certain point and then they go lower than that and they don't have the ability. So either they have to round at the back or they have to lean forward and then push their butt way back. So they don't have the hip flexion and compression strength that's needed to pull themselves down and stay vertical. That poses an enormous problem when people get tired, and then you see them either missing forward or running off the platforms with their lifts when they're tired because they don't have the ability to stay in a very vertical position. Whereas somebody that's like Matt Frazier that has great vertical squat mechanics in the snatch as a result of doing it as a sport for so many years is not facing those problems as frequently. So the movement limitations there will translate into snatch, thruster, clean, overhead squat, dumbbell squat snatch. Again, you're looking for themes with regards to the pattern of motion that the body has to express in a fatigue-based setting. So you're looking for carryover movements so that when you prescribe sessions in your training, you're not just training for 17.3, because remember in 2018, the workout's probably not going to be 17.3 unless it's a repeat. It's going to be a completely different workout with completely different confines or completely different parameters set on it. So you need to make sure that whatever you're training is getting better in case there's a repeat and also has carryover into other workouts if there's not a repeat. So the tools we talked about movement a little bit more in the energy system one, so I didn't want to recap that too much. You can go watch that video and see how we break down energy systems. But the tools to develop strength in the movement pattern, like in the snatch, you obviously have your traditional strength training protocols. So our experts in the CrossFit field that have put national qualifiers in weightlifting and have been world level qualifiers in weightlifting and have expertise with regards to all the specific nuance of the lifts. That's important. And you can do that with like the typical stuff, percentage-based programs, squat cycles, overhead squat loading, bent over rows to improve lat strength, doing pulls, positional strength, back bridge progressions and making sure that thoracic extension is good and overhead shoulder position is good, shrimp squats to work on some of the positional stuff. So there's tons of tools that you can use to improve the snatch or technical proficiency of chest to bars, and finding a gymnastics coach or finding somebody to improve your kip and arch swing. And all of those things are important in order to refine your training. The one thing to consider is that if we are broad generalists and you need these skills to be fatigue resistant, the likelihood of you being able to drive your positions to the point that you can be 100% proficient under fatigue is really low. And if a workout comes up like a snatch ladder, where it's 5 lifts in a row for speed at moderate loading that's not going to make most of the field fail, if you have perfect setup mechanics and a mind state that's developed to do the same thing over and over and over again, you actually could lose a second or 0.5 of a second every time you approach a barbell because your setup is too slow. So if you're using those experts with regards to cultivating skills for chest to bars and skills for snatches, that's good, and you should always develop the basics first. But just remember that you need to be able to develop those skills in a way that's conducive to setting you up for success in this sport. And this sport is going to challenge those patterns and challenge those positions in different ways. Then I just called this like base skill development. So, doing PVC work or doing empty barbell work or doing arch hollow work or doing, hollow body positional work on the floor, doing straight arm band lat pull downs, doing crossover symmetry and improving your ability to develop skills, and then base movement pattern development. So we talked about why movement in general as a discipline improves your ability to express capacity in the energy system course, or the movement course, but I was talking about the energy system YouTube video that was just posted. So go and watch that one to understand how important movement is to express capacity. I didn't want to go into that one on this video to make it redundant, but I wanted to make sure that I repeated how important that is to your long-term success. So then I'll go over and I'll explain what actual strength training protocols look like that are context specific to a CrossFit athlete trying to get better at something like 17.3 versus a normal strength training program that's sole focus is to improve somebody's ability to perform a 1 rep max snatch at the highest load, because they require different protocols and different nuance. Okay, so I put 3 protocols up like I put in the energy system video. The first protocol would be assault biking 60 to 40 cals at a 10-minute time trial pace. So if we're talking about a regional level athlete, generally, the males will go somewhere between 180 and 210 cals on a 10-minute test, and the females will go anywhere from 120 to 160. There's a more variance on that side because I think female body profiles range in body weight at a bigger percentage than the males. A lot of the males are kind of like jammed in the 170 to 195 range, and there's a couple people that are bigger than that and a couple people that are smaller, but it seems to be more tightly bound. So if we know that, then this is going to be like somewhere like 3 to 4 minutes ish at that pace. So a 10-minute time trial pace is pretty tough, but you should be able to hold it for 3 to 4 minutes. I don't want to say comfortably, because the middle portion of that test does get pretty nasty. So you are going to be facing some fatigue, and then get off and immediately perform 5 snatches as fast as possible, but for quality. So you want to make sure when you're training these that you're not, if you go to snatch and you step forward with a weight, you shouldn't count that rep. Or if you go to snatch and you chase the bar forward a couple steps, you shouldn't count that. You want to make sure that your training quality is held to such a high standard with regards to that movement, because each one of those little forward steps, if you're at your like threshold limit of what you can take, is probably going to be a miss on game day. So the higher of a standard you hold yourself to in training, the more likely you are to be able to make more often than not on game day. I put at 80 to 90% of the target load. The target load would be the target load that you want to be able to perform in a Metcon on game day. So if your goal is to be able to do snatch ladders up to 200 pounds as a female or 275 pounds as a female, then 80 to 90% of that should be something that you can do multiple intervals of without constantly jamming your knees and your hips and your central nervous system and putting yourself into the shitter. It should give you enough of an ability to recover. So rest as needed to recovery and repeat. So what we're doing here is challenging the global system of fatigue. So I should have a respiratory stress from the assault bike, and because there's a delay in cardiac stress, 3 or 4 minutes, your heart rate should be escalated to a high working rate. So you're basically getting yourself worked up into a fatigue state and then doing your lifting, as opposed to just doing 5 snatches for time or doing 40 snatches for time and needing rep 30 through 40 to be the ones that you're doing under fatigue. You can see that if we wanted to do, let's say we did 40 for time, and we're gonna get 10 total reps under fatigue, because the first 30, if your system is really developed, let's say you're gonna be fine and only the last 10 are gonna be in the pain zone. We can do 6 intervals of this where we're getting 30 snatches, and every single one of them is done in a globally stressed environment, so that you're accumulating more of the lifting under fatigue that you need, which is the stress that you need for the sport. And you then keep the total volume of lifting lower than at the target weight that you need to accumulate the reps. So if I needed to accumulate 30 reps of fatigue-based lifting and I was only using snatching, I would have to do 3 sets of 40 for time, which would be 120 total snatches at that weight just to accumulate them under fatigue. That seems like a very unintelligent way to accumulate volume if you want longevity in the sport. Like, yeah, you can tolerate it maybe when you're younger, but eventually your knees, hips, ankles, back are just not, and shoulders probably are not going to want to take that. So this would be a global and cardiac stress dependent workout. So let's say there's a workout next year that's rowing into progressive snatches, or a workout at the games where you got to run a mile and come back and hit 10 snatches for time, and they're scored as 2 different events. That would be the system or the systematic way to approach training that system. Then we're moving to number 2. So this workout would be more reflective of the actual specific stressors that you're going to get in 17.3. And a good way to approach figuring out how you construct these workouts is figure out what movements cause the movement pattern to deteriorate the most. So some people will be good at snatching after chest to bars, but horrible at snatching after toes to bar. And a good coach can start to figure out, like, okay, is it the hanging from the bar? Is it the kipping? Is it the core fatigue and then the inability to stabilize? Or are they worse with muscle ups? And you want to make sure that you pick the specific stressor that they need to get better. This is specific to that workout. So 6 sets of 5 unbroken chest to bars as fast as possible, 14 squat snatches at 95-65, then 6 sets of 5 unbroken chest to bars, and then 7 squat snatches at the target load. The target load here is not the same as what I meant up there. It's just like whatever weight that you want to be able to utilize in Metcons. That's what you would put here. So again, this is more dense in terms of contraction volume, so you probably would have to do less of these if you were repeating the intervals, but it gives you an option to figure out, like, okay, well, I'm loading the local muscle tissue in the chest to bars, and we're doing a lot of density. I'm doing 60 reps in a short period of time, and I'm overloading the squat snatch pattern. So I'm cramming a bunch of fatigue in, a bunch more, and at a bunch more of a dense level than you'll get in the actual 17.3 in a shorter period of time, and then hitting more snatches back to back to back without break at your target load. So it allows you to train upper body limitations. It allows you to deal with some global stress, similar to here, except the global stress is more specific to the sport. And it allows you to deal with the specific stressors that come out in the workout. So if you just look at these 2 things, this is what I would do more in the off season, and then this is what I would do in more of a sport specific prep phase. And then as I get closer to it, I'm just retesting 17.3. So as I get closer and closer to the sport, the training looks more and more and more like the sport. I think I take a little bit of a different approach than some of the other coaches that I know that are out there that say, well, training for the sport is the sport, so we just do more of the sport. I disagree with that. If you want to coach people for a really long period of time, I think if you're constantly utilizing the sport, I think your knees and your hips and your back and your shoulders only have so many contractions that they can take. So when you have the ability in an off season to work on structure and work on lowering the contraction volume, but still developing the ability to, or still maintaining the ability to progress over time, you should use that to your advantage to make sure that people get better without killing their bodies. And then the last one would be 30-second row at a really tough aerobic effort, 30-second rest, 30-second hollow rock, 30-second rest, 30-second toes to bar, 30-second rest, 800-meter run at an approximate 5K pace, and then come in, max snatches at target load. So by doing these intervals at really hard paces, what I'm doing is accumulating a bunch of fatigue substrate. I'm really fatiguing the core specifically in this one. So that would be something like 17.2, where you have a ton of toes to bar and then you have to stabilize the snatches, which require a bunch of midline control when you're under fatigue. And then I have those as my two major stresses. So I have core local muscle fatigue. I have respiratory stress because my breathing should be really elevated after all of this and the run. Generally, I find that respiratory cadence in running is about as high as you can get it. And if that's the case, then respiration is going to be driven way up by the time you get in. You're going to have cardiac stress just as a nature of how long this interval is. And by putting it max snatches in 1 minute, now I have a score and I have pressure in it. So then each lift is having sport-specific pressure on it to ensure that you're not missing. So it allows the athlete to start working on the psyche and understanding that, man, a miss costs me 20 seconds. If you miss your first lift, and you got to step back and breathe, get your head composed, and then walk back over and grab the bar, that's almost your whole minute gone. So it teaches athletes how to operate under pressure, but in a training environment. And again, you can rest to recovery and repeat these types of intervals. So you see that you can practice lifting under the specific context that you need it for the sport. Now, do you still need a strength program? Yes. Generally in the off season, if your max snatch is, let's say, Matt Frazier snatches 315 and Katrin snatches 200, and you use those for your models of what to get better at, and you look at all of your priorities and say like, okay, well, snatch is my priority, then your goal should be to drive your snatch up close to them in an unfatigued setting or a non-fatigue setting. You want then a basic strength training program, a basic squat program, basic positional development is all really important. But the reality is our sport is not going to test it that frequently in such a basic low intensity environment. Generally, it's going to be the third day of the games if just a pure max snatch comes out, or it's going to be, oh, you got 2 minutes to build to a max lift after doing a Metcon, or by the time you get to 265, you have to have done all of those chest to bars and all the squat snatches at all the lighter barbells before you even have a chance to express your strength. So if that's the case, you need to have training protocols in your strength training that are system specific. It's not just strength that you're looking to develop now in the traditional way that weightlifting coaches will prescribe strength. It's context specific expression of your weightlifting ability, and that has to be trained. There's not going to be automatic carryover. I know somebody like Matt Frazier can do it under fatigue at the highest level, but that doesn't mean every ex-weightlifter that comes in is going to be able to express their weightlifting ability under fatigue, because he also has an awesome engine and awesome positions and awesome muscle endurance and all the things that are required to be a great CrossFit athlete. So make sure when you're designing your strength training protocols, and they need to be like fatigue based with some energy systems in, that you're thinking about the type of fatigue that you're going to experience in workouts that limit you, and you're imposing that fatigue on your body and practicing in as safe of a setting as possible how to execute your lifts and hit them at the loads that you want to hit them, so you're prepared for something like 17.3 if it comes back out next year, or 16.2, or whatever test Castro is able to come up with next year.